And as you know, we usually record the class, so just know that anything you say or an expression, facial or otherwise, that you offer is something that can be shared on the cloud and with others. So just be aware of that, be aware of that. So somebody mentioned about looking forward to the class because they love learning. And that's kind of a part of the theme that I want to address today. But I'm going to start with, of course, looking at the parashah, at least momentarily. And I didn't notice this, to be honest, until about 10 minutes ago. But it occurred to me, if we look at the parashah, which often Bernie reads for us, unfortunately we didn't hear him today, but maybe on another occasion. It starts off like this. Vayikach Korach ben Yitzhar ben Kahat ben Levi v'Datan v'Aviram b'nei Eliyav v'On ben Pelet b'nei Ruvain. That's the first verse. So anybody who knows some Hebrew, it says Vayikach Korach, and Korach took. And then it lists a number of other people who happened to be with Korach. And then the next verse it says Vayakumu, and they rose up against Moshe, in front of Moshe, etc. But what did Korach take? Vayikach is a transitive verb, meaning it's got to have some kind of an object. Korach took. So if I look at the Eitz Chaim translation, it says, now Korach, son of Yizhar, it's putting the verb somewhere else. Now Korach, son of Yizhar, son of Kehat, son of Levi, betook himself. And what does betook himself mean? So it got me thinking, as I talked a little bit about this morning in the Minyan, about the nature of rebellion, the nature of revolt, the nature of demonstration, the nature of dissatisfaction with a status quo, with the way things are. And so what does it mean, Vayikach Korach? And then it gives a list of people. He didn't take those people. He's not talking about gathering those people. It talks about afterwards that they gathered other members of the community, etc. But it first opens with this idea of Vayikach Korach, translated here in the time, betook himself. And I think it's saying something not in general about rebellion or revolt. It's saying something about the nature of this particular revolt. It says Vayikach Korach. Korach took. Korach sought to take, sought to retake. It doesn't talk about perhaps what should be the nature of rebellion or revolt. And the nature of this one, as Korach saw it, is not the one that we should want to follow. And as a matter of fact, in Pirkei Avot, when it talks about things that are done in the name of Torah, with the right direction, with the right ethical and moral values, it gives an example of those things that are not the revolt of Korach. It doesn't say revolt or rebellion is a bad thing. It says that Korach's type of revolt or rebellion is a bad thing. He didn't go about it the right way. He didn't have what he should have had as the basis for rebellion and revolt. And if we look at Korach and the people that he gathered, we find this interesting alliance of expediency, meaning we find people gathered together from different backgrounds, and you try to understand, why would those people gather together? What did they have in common, other than the fact that they're all Israelites? They all came out of Egypt. They all witnessed the miracle of the crossing of the Reed Sea, of Yam Suf. They all witnessed, in one way or another, revelation. So they share these experiences, but what do they have in common that they come together to try to upset the status quo? And if you look at where they come from, let's try to understand what the nature of it is. So we have Korach and others from the tribe of Levi. And as you recall, at Mount Sinai, the events leading to the worship of the golden calf granted the Levites the status of the premier tribe, displacing the Reubenites, who were the Bechorim, the firstborn, because the Levites were the only ones who didn't participate, supposedly, in the worship of the golden calf, and took upon them the task assigned to them by Moses to punish, to literally kill those who had been directly involved. So they gained this new status. So what's Korach's problem with this? He's part of that tribe with this wonderful status. And we've just been reading in other weekly portions all the special privileges and tasks and duties that the Levites have. So he's dissatisfied because he's not Aaron. He's not part of the family of Aaron, who are to become the priests who have the ultimate function within the worship taking place in the Mishkan and later in the temple. He's not satisfied with being one of the regular Levites. He wants to have that special task, and perhaps even more, he wants to displace or replace Aaron or even Moses. So that's Korach's issue. What about Datan v'Aviram? These two members of the Reubenites. I mentioned them before. What could they, together with On ben Pelet, some interesting personality that we know nothing about other than his mention here, what could they possibly have that they're dissatisfied with? They are dissatisfied because they have been displaced by the Levites. Their privilege, their status as the firstborn and the leaders has been taken away from them. And there are also 250, as they say, Kriei Moed, Nesi'ei Edah, chieftains, 250 Israelites, chieftains of the community, chosen the assembly, men of repute. So reputable leaders gathered from other tribes who also are dissatisfied with something, possibly because the fact that they're going to be staying in the desert for 40 years as a result of what happened last week's parashah with the spies, their leadership doesn't mean a whole lot, and they're maybe not satisfied with that. They were looking forward to a conquest of the Holy Land, even though they were probably part of those who were not crazy about going up in light of the evidence and suggestions of the 10 out of the 12 spies. So there's this group, disparate group of people who are dissatisfied with what the status quo happens to be at the time. And they each have their own interest. They each have their own agenda. And you might ask, what is it? There might even be conflicting agendas there, and yet they've come together momentarily, perhaps on a temporary basis, in order to supplant the current leadership and see about their own interests and furthering those interests. What might happen later when the interests with others within that temporary alliance conflict? Who knows? What happens usually when people gather together in a temporary alliance and they've managed to change something? What happens afterwards? Often those conflicting interests, which were shoved under the carpet temporarily, come out, and those people begin fighting with one another. And I mentioned this morning in the Minyan, something I've been watching recently that I missed years ago. Anyone seen the series Sons of Anarchy? So if you haven't seen that, in a nutshell, really very briefly, it's about a motorcycle gang that kind of runs a town in California. But part of their challenge is different groups that they have to deal with. And of course, it's all along various racial, ethnic lines. There's a group of Mexicans, Hispanics, there's a group of Blacks, there's a group of Chinese, and there's a group of neo-Nazis. And how do all these groups get together? They don't. But they do form temporary alliances to serve each other's interests. And of course, there's some kind of underlying, perhaps greater good within the show, but I won't get into that because I don't want to offer a spoiler. But my point being that people with very different interests sometimes come together in order to achieve something, but that something they're trying to achieve is very rarely, if ever, something that is in the interests of all. It's something that will temporarily serve their interests at the moment, but the moment that there is no longer a self-interest being served, then that temporary alliance will fall apart and people will begin fighting again. And as I mentioned this morning as well, I listened to a radio show, I think I mentioned it last week as a matter of fact, where they interviewed a Black woman in Toronto from the Black LGBTQ community. And they were asking her as part of the show, who are your allies? Who do you try to gather together in order to further the interest of greater tolerance, racial diversity, acceptance of sexual preference, etc.? So she says, well, to be honest, I'm not really looking for allies because I don't want people who, out of their own interest, out of their own remorse for perhaps things they should have done or shouldn't have done, will join me temporarily because they see it fits their agenda at the moment. I don't need allies. I need people who believe in our goals of being more inclusive, of being more tolerant, of finding and building and sustaining a community where everyone is recognized and accepted for whatever they are and however they define themselves. And that was a very powerful statement about what it means to be an ally and the need to find something that people have in common in order to build something better. So that brings me back to this idea. So what is a rebellion? What is a worthwhile rebellion or revolt? And how does that play out in Jewish history? How are Jewish values served by rebellion? So we can look at physical military revolt, and there are many examples of that, of course, in Jewish history. Without asking you, I know were I to do that, you would throw out, well, there's the Hashmonaim. Chanukah is all about a military revolt, together with a spiritual ritual revolt. We have the Bar Kokhba revolt. We have the revolts by the Zealots and the Sicarii during the time of the Romans leading up to the destruction of the Second Temple. We have, in a more contemporary sense, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, people who sought to revolt militarily to whatever extent they were able to. We have, on a more recent basis even than that, we have a group called the Panterim HaShorim, the Black Panthers. You're familiar with that group out of Oakland in the United States back in the 60s and 70s, but they're the Black Panthers in Israel, Sephardic Mizrahi group who were dissatisfied with the status quo, with the discrimination and oppression, in their words, that they faced in Israel at the hands of the Ashkenazi ruling elite. And we have all sorts of other examples of not violent, not military, but demonstration and expression of dissatisfaction with the status quo. We have everything that's going on right now around the world, more so even in the United States. If we go back a little bit, we have the social action as expressed and exemplified by Heschel during the civil rights movement in the United States. We have another rabbi who was part of a march on Shavuot in her community. The shuls were closed, and I imagine it wasn't only because the shul was closed, but she decided, as a leader in the Jewish community, to join a demonstration for Black Lives Matter on Shavuot, on one of the holy days of the year, on a festival, to be out there on the street, because that's what Judaism should be about, dealing with oppression, discrimination, racial issues, ethnic issues, religious issues, and being out there in the front to make sure that you're making a statement about that. And in Israel, very, very recently, we have all sorts of a demonstration against, and whatever your position is this, I don't know, but I imagine most of us should be dissatisfied with what's going on in Israel in terms of a move toward annexation of the West Bank, or at least large tracts of it, and the demonstration that took place in Tel Aviv, among many other demonstrations historically. We have also demonstrations by local politicians in Israel, very powerful demonstrations and expression of dissatisfaction by what they see as religious oppression, opening up public transportation on Shabbat for people that need to get around and want to get around, and for whom traveling on a bus or other means is not something that is anathema to them in terms of their understanding of what Shabbat is all about. And we have recently as well moves by local politicians, especially in Tel Aviv, recognizing that access to civil marriage ceremonies and status is something that should be available to all Israelis. As you probably know, and this is a different issue altogether, but just to mention it, if you want to get married in Israel, you have to do it within your religious faith community, whether you be Christian, Muslim, or Jewish. You can't have a civil marriage ceremony. Those who have issues with the way that's done in Israel under the auspices of the rabbinate, and it has certain interpretations and understandings of what that ceremony should look like. And there are many people who want to get married otherwise, so often they go outside of Israel to have a civil marriage ceremony. That's not offered. Recently in Tel Aviv, very recently, the mayor had the audacity to allow non-married couples to register as couples, whether it's something called known in public, yedua batzibur, as we say, informal relationships that don't go through a regular marriage ceremony, allowing those people to get the benefits of sharing a life together, whether they're financial, etc. So there are a lot of ways in which we can demonstrate, in which we can rebel, revolt against what we see as the status quo. But a lot of that in our tradition is based on, before we get to that point where we're ready to demonstrate, we can't do it on a knee-jerk basis. We can't do it only as a gut reaction. We have to do it through some kind of education and understanding of what the issues at stake are. And that's why I'm glad somebody said at the beginning of the class, before we even started, we need to go on learning. And when we look at this week's parashah, one of the things that a commentator, you may have heard of the name Yeshayahu Leibowitz, says in terms of Korach's rebellion. Korach says, if you recall, it says, why have you put yourselves above the nation? All the Israelites are holy. We are a holy nation. We all have this equal status of holiness. And Leibowitz says, Korach misquoted. He misunderstood, misinterpreted what the Torah says. The Torah says in Leviticus, Kedoshim tihiyu, ki kadosh ani, Adonai Elohechem. You shall be holy in the future, meaning you have to go through some kind of process. You are not holy now. You may be on your way to being holy. You may have achieved some kind of levelness of holiness, and we've talked about that in the past several weeks ago, but you're not holy yet, and you can never, or perhaps will never, achieve an ultimate holiness, and that of God, of course. And what is that telling us? It means that we have to constantly be in a process of trying to be holier than we are. And again, holy, I'm not talking about in a ritual sense. I'm not talking about in a saintly sense. I'm talking about in a sense of achieving and striving towards something of the divine, which, as we've talked about before, meaning all of us being created in the divine images, all of us having something in common. And in order to achieve that, we have to learn about all the different elements in that, all the different representatives of divine creation. We have to see ourselves around the world in whatever faith, ethnic, racial community with which we associate or affiliate. We have to see what we have in common. That's what Korach didn't do. He assumed he was there. He assumed he knew what it meant to be holy, but he misunderstood. It's something that is an ongoing process. And that ongoing process is an ongoing process to rebel, to revolt against the status quo, meaning to change things always for the better meaning for a common good, not for self-serving, expedient interests of alliance, but for something that serves everybody's good eventually. How we define that, of course, is a complicated and not so easy task. But the only way we can do that is through getting familiar with that which we don't know, that with which we're unfamiliar or sufficiently familiar, through education. And for that reason, especially since we've been talking about issues as they relate to Canada as much as Black Lives Matter in the United States, I invited somebody today to share a little bit about her experience with learning to be part of that process of becoming holy, about educating ourselves, about going out there and learning and trying to do something concrete and practical in order to grow personally and in order to be involved with those with whom we're not so familiar. And I just want to refer for a moment to something we talked about before. We talked about various days that are marked in our calendar. We talked about National Indigenous Peoples Day, which took place this last Sunday. We talked about Juneteenth last Friday and how it has become something very powerful as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And as I didn't mention, but I'll mention now, anyone know what Discovery Day is? Anyone ever hear of Discovery Day? Discovery Day is a day that is celebrated, just celebrated a few days ago, in Newfoundland and Labrador. Similar to Columbus Day in the United States, and I gave you a list of more than 15 states which have changed the name of Columbus Day in the States, which celebrates the discovery of America by a white European 500 plus years ago. They've changed it to Indigenous Peoples National Day as well in the States. That's in October. Ours is now in June. But they've made the realization that narratives, as we spoke about last time, need to be more inclusive and more understanding that there are various narratives, not just our European colonial narrative. And so this idea that Discovery Day, it was just announced a couple of weeks ago that the name is going to be changed. It's no longer going to be called Discovery Day in Newfoundland and Labrador, and that is going to be done not arbitrarily, not authoritatively by a political leadership, but in consultation with Indigenous groups in Newfoundland and Labrador. And somebody mentioned before, right at the beginning, Newfoundland, and then I thought, Discovery Day, what does Newfoundland mean? Newfound land. What an inappropriate name for a province, especially one that has just declared that its narrative of Discovery Day is inappropriate. Will that province have the courage and audacity to consider changing its name? Are the Washington Redskins going to change their name? There's so many opportunities for us to be and show and demonstrate a greater sensitivity to the narratives that we've been sharing and the names we designate for celebrations. It's almost endless. Statues being torn down, names being changed, etc. There's a long way to go and a lot of opportunity to continue with that. But that's something we need at some point to set out on. And so that's the reason I invited Sydney to join us today. Sydney, besides all the other accolades I could share with you about her, Sydney has the commitment, the dedication to explore, to understand, to learn about issues that are of relevance. And she took the very bold, and I don't hesitate to say courageous step, of going along with a number of other young people to work as a summer counselor in a small Indigenous, more specifically a Cree community on the Quebec side, the eastern side of James Bay. And I thought that it would be fascinating as we've been discussing Indigenous issues and how we need to understand more about what their narrative is, specifically here in Canada. I thought it would be fascinating to hear from Sydney what some of her experiences were last summer, events leading up to it, what she was able to do there, what she was able to learn, some of the travails and the challenges that she faced. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the microphone, so to speak, to Sydney. So Sydney, I've also made you co-host if you need to share a screen.
Thank you.
And please, Sydney, pleasure to have you. And I know we all look forward to hearing what you have to say and share with us.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Thanks for that introduction. So it was sort of, interesting for me to relive this experience again, sort of making my notes. I kind of tell family and friends about my experience in the Indigenous space sort of through stories or little snippets. So it was kind of interesting for me to kind of make it a little bit more organized and chronological for all of you. So I hope this is, just as I hope it's beneficial for you, I know that it was also beneficial for me too, to sort of rewrite and re-experience what I did this past summer. So a little bit about me. So I'll be entering my third year at McGill University in September, studying anthropology and Indigenous studies. And just like Michael said, this past summer, I was lucky enough to be able to go to a Cree community in northern Quebec. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. And can everybody see this okay? It's just a PDF document, white screen. So the community that I went to was called Wamindji, which is right over here. And Wamindji is one of 9 communities in an area called Iuichi, which is the Cree name for the traditional territory on the east side of James Bay. And it's sort of, you can see it, the whole area is outlined in white. And if you're anything like me, I had no idea what Wamindji was. I had never heard of the place before, let alone how to pronounce it. And just out of curiosity, has anybody heard of any of these communities before? You can unmute yourselves if you have, or shake your head if nobody's ever heard of them before. Yeah, so, I mean, I think it's interesting just to think about that and reflect that, in our own country, there's still so much that we just don't know about. So it's a very small community compared to some of these more inland communities. Wominji is along the water. There's about 1,400 people that live there. You can walk around the perimeter of the community in about half an hour, which I did multiple times. So it's quite small. And this is a map of Wominji, which I always love to show people because I think you get a nice sense of really how small the community is. So this was where I lived, along this road here. And if you just walked along here, you would kind of get to the school, which is where I worked out of the summer camp, out of the school here. And then along this street were all the main businesses. So there was a laundromat, there was a clinic, there was, oh gosh, if I remember, a fire station, police station, and then there was sort of like the Justice Building. So there was sort of one of everything that you would really need in a community. And Michael mentioned that some of you had seen the movie Grizzlies, or you talked about the movie Grizzlies before. Is that right, Michael?
Yes.
Okay. So if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's a really amazing film. I actually watched it once before I came to the community, and then I watched it again afterwards just to see if my experience watching it was different or if I noticed some different things, and I did. So I'm going to share some of that with whoever has seen the movie. So really quickly, this movie is about this white teacher that comes from the South to a community called Kugluktuk in Nunavut. And he ends up creating this lacrosse team with all of the youth or some of the youth at the school that he works at. And it's sort of, there's much more complicated, nuanced storytelling within there, but that's sort of the gist of it. And the first thing that he notices when he gets there is everything is in very poor condition. Okay, there's this tiny, little police station. There's teenagers everywhere. They're smoking. They're drinking. They're, it's very dark. I know it looked very sad for me. That's sort of the way that I saw it. It was portrayed in this light of everyone kind of living this very sad life. And this is a photo that I took the first day that I got to Wominji. And the roads are paved, the sidewalks are paved, the houses are newly built. And this is also quite unique to Wominji. This is not like every community. There are some communities that are not as well kept for a number of reasons. But one thing that I really was fascinated by about Wominji is their flourishing economy that they have. And this is due to a man that we talked about a lot with people who were there, whose name was Walter Huboy. And he created this corporation called the Tawich Development Corporation. I'll scroll up for a second. They actually created this diagram here, which is why I used it. And what they did is when they got all of this money from Hydro-Quebec, instead of distributing it to individual people in the community, they decided to grow this collective asset by creating businesses that would benefit everyone. And you could really see that when this community was able to have the autonomy to create this business, they really did what was best for the community. They were able to create jobs for everyone, and that was a really, really special thing to see. So that's sort of a little bit about the community. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what I actually did there. So a little bit about how I sort of became specifically interested in working with Indigenous people, working in the Indigenous space, was during my first year at university. So I took this Intro to Indigenous Studies class, not really thinking much of it. It was honestly one of the few classes that had available spots, because in your first year, sort of all of these small classes get taken that, I initially wanted. So I kind of just put myself into this class, not really thinking much of it. And I quickly realized that I was oblivious to so much more than I ever thought I was. We do a unit on residential schools in grade 10, and then, we never really speak about anything else. And I instantly became fascinated with the readings that we did in this class. Our professor was the first Indigenous person that I had ever met, and he was an amazing, amazing speaker. He would bring in guests into our class every Friday. So we had elders who would come in and speak with us about their experiences, would tell us stories. And I talked about this class all the time. And so one day my roommate said, have you heard of this organization called Frontier College? And I was like, no, what is that? And she said, you have to apply for this summer program. It would be perfect for you. It's kids, it's working in the Indigenous community. And at first I was sort of a bit hesitant after being in this class for an entire year, where we talk about how often people from the South, non-Indigenous people, will go into northern communities and do things that aren't beneficial with the community. It kind of made me a little bit hesitant to go and do it myself. But the more that I talked about it, and I talked about it with my professor, and I told him about some of my worries, he reassured me, and I applied for the job, and I was interviewed, and I got the job. So what was the job specifically? So first of all, a little bit about Frontier College. So it's a literacy organization, and they have programs for kids and for adults to promote literacy. And in the summer, they offer this camp, this literacy camp for Indigenous communities all throughout Canada. So they have them in Quebec, they have them in Nunavut, they have them in Newfoundland and Labrador. And the goal of this camp is to prevent summer reading loss. So a lot of the time when kids leave school in the summer, they aren't able to retain everything they learned in school. So with this camp, we would run fun, engaging, but also literacy-based activities. So we would do cooking, we would do art, we would do sports, those kinds of activities, but also incorporate literacy into everything that we did. So there are two things that this camp did that I purposefully left out in the way I explained the camp. And I always like to do that whenever I'm explaining the camp, because from what I described, the camp sounds pretty great, right? People from the South will fly into the community, will work with the kids, will help them with their reading. It sounds great. Well, actually, it's not so great, because from what I explained, there was one, no greater community engagement, and two, there were no community members that were actually involved in the camp itself. And this is a very, very dangerous trap to fall into, especially for Indigenous communities, because as many of us know, time after time, people from the South will come in, they'll do their programs for teens, for kids, but fail to truly engage with the community. And I don't mean engage with the community as in, do one activity with the kids for the summer and then like, that's it. I mean, truly collaborate with them. And instead of, saying, oh, well, like I'm inviting community members into this program, instead of, rather than being having more of a collaborative approach with them. And the reason why I did this camp, why I did the literacy camp, is because they are able to do both of those things in a really special way. So the first thing that they do is they hire local counselors from the communities to work with the counselors from the South. So this is a photo, one of my favorite photos, all the counselors. So this is all of the counselors from the South and from the North all together. So we had a week of training in Val d'Or. And except for the first day. So the first day of training, it was just the Southern counselors. We learned about, history and in residential schools, things that people from the communities, definitely did not need to hear about from white people. And so we were all brought together for an entire week, and, we did training together. And the second thing that the program values is the importance of community engagement. And so the first thing when we got to the community, me and my co-counselors, is we went to all of those places that I said before. We went to the clinic, we went to the police station, and we went to the fire station. And it's important that I note here that unfortunately in Wamingji, the Frontier College literacy camp was unable to find a local counselor for us. I don't really specifically know exactly why. I'm not sure if it was lack of interest or if the plans fell through for the local counselor. But when we got there, we tried so hard to recruit someone and find someone who was able to work. So we ended up finding someone towards the end, which I'll tell you a little bit about later. But sort of back to community engagement, it was funny. It was challenging at first, to get people not only interested in wanting to come and do activities with us, but also just to purely get in contact with them in the first place. We finished camp at 5 p.m. every day. And by the time we would go to visit these people, like Calvin at the fire station, who was the police chief, he would be gone, and we would try to call him, and he would never answer us. And it was a little bit frustrating at first. We would talk to the other counselors, through Facebook, and ask them if they had the same problem, engaging with the community. And it was, it was sort of something that we all were facing together. But then one day, sort of midway through the first week of camp, or I'd say towards the end of the first week of camp, all the kids were playing outside in the playground, and I see this police officer playing with the kids at the playground. We didn't know that they were going to be coming. We had no idea that they were going to show up, but we walk outside and they're playing with the kids. And so we learned that instead of trying to adapt to the community, instead of trying to fit the community into our plans, we had to adapt to them, right? We had to let them take control of whatever they were able to do, and we had to sort of abandon all of our daily scheduling and let them do whatever they could do when they could do it. So these police officers would end up coming, oh my gosh, more than once a week even. They would play Uno, they played card games with the kids, they would read with them, they would cook with them. They kind of became, we would joke with them, our other campers. They were amazing. So the goal of the camp is to eventually be completely community run, and they're not quite there yet. So by community run, I mean no Southern counselors. The goal is to be completely run by people from the community. And this was actually an interesting test run this year with COVID happening, that they were able to run a few literacy camps this summer, just internally, just kids, just from counselors from the community. Unfortunately, Womenji has a hard time getting youth to run these camps, but hopefully at some point they're able to. And this is Samia here doing an activity with us and the kids, and she was our local counselor who worked with us for the last sort of week in a bit of camp. So it was amazing to have her with us. I mean, not only did she know the kids, but she had, she was able to help us too. So it was sort of this, amazing thing that was able to happen, and we were so sad we only got to sort of have her for this end of camp. So in terms of community engagement, there was a really special program that we did with the kids at the community hall, and it was all about language. And this was something in particular that really resonated with me, particularly because of the Jewish connection. So I thought that I would bring it up with you all today. So the Cree language is taught in schools in Womenji beginning in grade 1. And at the camp, unfortunately, there were not many books in Cree. So there were still, I'd say, a majority, not even a majority, 100 books, I would say, were in English. So the organization sent up books, and then I'd say maybe 5 maximum books were in Cree. And this is partially due to the fact that there's not many books published in Cree. There's not a lot available right now. Most storytelling is done orally and isn't done through writing. And so what we were able to do is we were able to meet with Teresa, with this woman at the community center, who would read with the kids in Cree every week, and who would print off songs. You'll see those yellow and blue pages, who would print off songs in Cree and sing with them and read with them. And this was the first time, for the counselors to see that most of the kids, knew how to speak Cree. And they never really spoke it at camp, but the second that they were with Teresa, they were singing. Kids that would never really speak at camp were speaking more than ever before. And this was really it reminded me of sort of moments in the Grizzlies movie where it wasn't only, the kids that were benefiting from the teacher, it was the teacher that was also benefiting and learning and being inspired by the kids. And the kids were so excited to show us, the syllabics and the different elements of Cree. So that was a really special moment for us. And there were a lot of parallels that I found when I sort of came back and was thinking about that experience more between, the Crees and Womenji, but also how Jewish people have this really special tie to language. And just like with Hebrew, with modern Hebrew, they're able to take this oral language and make it accessible. They're reviving, an ancient language, and they're using it in everyday conversation, in everyday life. So that was something that was really powerful. It showed me how resilient the community in Womenji was, and yeah, that was a very special moment for me and for the kids. And I also spent a lot of time at the youth center, partially because there was very good Wi-Fi. Um, yeah, there was no Wi-Fi in our apartment. But yes, there were guitars here. There were sort of ping pong tables and games. It was a great space. And during my first week there, I met Brian, who ran the youth center, and we would sort of just chat a lot about, sports. We would talk about sort of anything and everything, but our conversations sort of became deeper. And he loved to talk to me about different traditions, and specifically, he loved hearing about Jewish traditions. And I remember at first I was nervous to talk about being Jewish. I don't really know exactly why. I haven't thought about it enough. I think it's a mixture of feeling vulnerable and not being so sure what I should say. But it's such a big part of me that it felt kind of silly to not talk about it. And one thing that really stuck with me was the way that he talked about how similar Havdalah was to the ceremony that they do called smudging, which is where they burn medicines gathered from the earth, and they burn it to purify the body, to wake them up, to mark these new beginnings. And he wished that I could do Havdalah there, and that's more that I wanted to do it so badly, just to have a Havdalah candle there. He was very fascinated with it all, and to see that we do Havdalah to get outside of the comfort of Shabbat, to get ready for the week. And it was amazing to see how interested they were in just seeing connections between traditions. That was something that I know Brian really valued, but also other members in the community really valued. It was just sharing that love of tradition. So this is the last thing that I sort of want to touch upon. This is one of my favorite photos from my time in Wominji. And you may be wondering, why is a photo of food from Facebook your favorite photo? What is this? And it's not really about the photo. It's more so what came out of this photo. So this was during sort of this photo was taken, I think, my third week of camp. So out of the 4 weeks, it was pretty later on in the summer. And we were told at training that something that they suggest is joining Facebook groups in the communities, because that's the best way to see what's going on. They don't really, they do have a radio, so that's sometimes how they'll relay different events that are happening. But the biggest thing is for everyone to maintain that sense of community is they post things on Facebook. And one of these groups that they had in Wominji was all people who were selling food. There aren't any restaurants in Wominji, so if parents or families want a break to cook, they'll buy food off of other people in the community. And so I saw that one night there was a man named Sammy who was selling plates of walleye fish, which if any of you haven't tried it, it's probably the most delicious fish. And there's a lot of walleye in Wominji that they fish right along the water. And so, I was like, should I get it? I don't really know. Maybe I shouldn't. Went back and forth in my head. And then I finally decided, no, you know what? I'm going to message Sammy and I'm going to go over to his house and buy this plate of food. So as I said before, there's no Wi-Fi, there's no internet. And even though it's a small community, it is very easy to get lost. There are windy streets, streets that lead into other streets. And still, it was my third week and I still didn't really know how to get around everywhere. So I kind of jotted the notes down on a piece of paper, and I started walking to his house. And I think about halfway there, I knew I was lost, but I didn't fully accept it yet. I was still kind of walking around, thinking I knew where I was. And I hear my name being called, and I turned around and I see this teenage girl, and she was like, Sydney? And I looked at her. I'd never met her before. I had no idea she knew who I was. And she said, are you okay? You look like you're lost, or I don't know if she said lost. She was like, oh, do you need any help finding anything? And I said, oh, actually, I'm looking for Sammy. I'm trying to get his plate of walleye. And she said, oh, you're going the wrong way. And I sort of chuckled and I said, okay. And she sort of showed me where to go. And it was this very simple interaction that I had with her. And then I later met Sammy and I got the plate and all was good. It was delicious. But it was this next day when it was Wominji's birthday, and they built this huge teepee across from the youth center. And I walked in and I saw Wanda, who helped me the other day, and her friend Dylan, who were there. And the first thing Wanda asked me was about the fish and if I liked the walleye. That was the first thing she said to me. And we got into this whole conversation about fishing and hunting And they invited me to join them on their walk along the river later that afternoon. And I became really close with this group of teenagers. And, you know, it was a long process. Like, it wasn't until the last week, right? When I met them, it wasn't like I went there and instantly everyone was open and, you know, wanting to talk. But doing something as simple as joining a Facebook group and buying fish from Sammy led me to this amazing, amazing group of teenagers who I'm still in contact with today. So the literacy camp was amazing on its own. I didn't talk much about it, but if anyone has questions more specifically about the camp, I can talk about that. But for me, creating such a special relationship with Wanda, with Brian, with Teresa, with such kind, welcoming people, that was something that I could have never imagined would happen in a month. You know, I knew that I would be doing this camp and that would be a learning experience. That would be an amazing experience, but I had no idea that I would be meeting and becoming so close with so many people in the community. So I kind of wanted to leave you with that story. I'll stop sharing my screen now. But if anybody has any questions or about something I said, or if there's anything that I didn't maybe touch on that you're interested in, I'd be happy to try to answer them as best as I can. Sharon, I'll unmute you, or you can unmute yourself.
Does that
Yes.
work?
Yes.
Can you hear? Okay. So where did you live when you were there?
Good question. So there's a whole bunch of houses there that are reserved for teachers that fly into the community and work there during the year. So they're called Cree School Board houses. And so during the summer, when the teachers aren't there anymore, the literacy camp has a partnership with the Cree School Board. And so we're able to, the organization rents out those houses, and that's where we lived. So we lived in the community in a house.
And did it cost you anything to go there?
No, which is also really interesting. It kind of wasn't that volunteer kind of experience. It was a job. So our flights were paid for, our housing was paid for, and we got paid for being there. But the reason why it was fantastic. And the reason why they do that is because they're also paying the local counselors. So it's again to create that partnership. It's not like one person gets paid, one person doesn't. Like, you're all working together. So you should all get paid.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Sydney, it's Brenda.
Yes, Brenda. Yes.
How are you? And Kola Kavad, that was
thank you.
Really, really, really. But
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
It sums up this whole thing of our lack of knowledge and understanding about the Indigenous culture. And last week, as part of an assignment, Michael asked us to do a little research into how the first Europeans greeted the first Indigenous people when they came here 500 years ago. And if I could just have your permission just to read a short quote, I think it'll sum up what you did and how much of an impact it will have on your life and probably all of the people that you work with. It's called the shockwave. It's been 7 lifetimes since Europeans first arrived on the shores of North America. Our ancestors, of course, had already lived here for many thousands of years. But as early as that very first encounter, extraordinary events began to occur among us. That initial meeting touched up a shockwave that was felt by Indian people right across the continent, and it is still felt to this day.
Very good.
And that sums up what we still have a lot to learn and a lot to understand and a lot more to appreciate of how they were treated and continue to be treated, and what you're doing, and hopefully more kids and people like yourselves will continue to do. So once again, Kola Kavod.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that as well.
Sydney?
Yes.
Okay, so...
Wait, who is speaking?
Sharon.
Oh, Sharon. Yes, Sharon. Okay.
So you hear in the news about young Indigenous children or kids, teens, we'll say, in different parts of the North, Ontario, Quebec, who are frustrated or angry or whatever with their lives, and they commit suicide, which is beyond, right? Beyond. Was any talk about frustration or anger or anything in the group settings that you were with?
Yes, but very briefly. And I think that has to do with the amount of time that I was there. I wasn't, again, as I said, that the youth are the hardest people that I found to connect with. It was much easier, always. And it was much easier for me to speak with the adults, not even like just generally. So for me to even be able to be welcome into this small, tight-knit group of friends who I'm still talking with today. I actually saw them in Montreal in December. They were there on their way to a trip to actually Australia for a program. But I did speak with them very briefly about it. And that's sort of all I'll say about that. The rest I kind of want to leave between us because of the way that they talked about it. It seems like it's not my place to speak about their experience with that. But really, for the most part, our conversations were not about that at all. They were kind of just about everyday things. And they weren't really focused on the hardships, which I'm aware that they face and they did speak about with me. I don't know if I feel completely comfortable sharing that from my perspective.
And Barb wanted to ask a question.
Yes.
Hi, it's Barbara here. I'm curious to know if you were able to acquire any of the Cree language yourself.
Oh my gosh, a couple of words. Miigwech is thank you. Gugum is grandma. And that's kind of the extent. Those are the two words that were very important that every kid said. But yeah, the language itself was very difficult. And the kids talked about that a lot too. There's a lot to learn with the language. But I tried to learn a little bit while I was there. Yes, thank you.
Okay, Sydney, I saw. Oh, go ahead, Ruth. Go ahead, Ruth. Just turn off your mute. Let me see if I can help. Yeah, you're off. Go ahead.
Hi, Sydney.
Hi.
Would you do this again, or would you explore another region?
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about that. So thank you, Ruth, for bringing that up. But I sort of made a personal promise to myself that if I was to do the literacy camp again, I would go back to the same community if I had a good experience. And by good, I just mean I felt safe, because a lot of the times people have, unfortunately, very challenging experiences in the community. Sometimes they come back just for various reasons. So I sort of told myself that if it was a positive experience, I mean, there were challenging moments for sure, but overall a positive and a safe experience, I would go back to the community. And I want to be able to go to other Indigenous communities, but with another program at another time. If I was to do the literacy camp again, I would be going back to Wamindji for sure. And again, just to provide that continuity, that sort of, for the kids, but also for me, I want to be able to deepen those relationships that I made. So yeah, I was really excited to go back this summer, and unfortunately, due to all of this, I wasn't able to go back. But hopefully, I'll be able to go back maybe even next summer. Thanks, Ruth. Okay.
So Sydney, I had a couple things I just wanted to share, a few observations. First of all, I'm always fascinated by the language we use, which kind of reflects quite a bit about how we see ourselves in a certain scenario and how we see others. And it's interesting that I mean, I'm not sure, I can't think of an alternative, but the way you describe the fact that they're the Southern counselors and the Northern counselors, this dichotomy of our source and how we define it. And I don't know if they saw it geographically as well, but I think that's fascinating that there was this differentiation based on wherever we come from, but based on geography, not based on color, race, or anything. It's based on geography. And I think that's probably as appropriate a designation as anything, because I know from what little I am familiar with Indigenous culture, geography is often a very powerful element of their identity. And I would hazard to say that designation is in fact some kind of recognition of the way they would see it as well, even if perhaps the words north, south might not be their choice, but I think that geographical designation is very powerful. The other thing I noticed, first of all, we've been talking about police so much over the last month, and the fact that the police are having a sensitivity and a willingness to integrate, encounter, engage with the community in the way that they do. Where are those police from, by the way? What's their background?
So the police chief is from Wamindji, so he oversees everyone. But there were two police officers who would come with the chief who were from Quebec. So they were from the South.
Okay, great. No, that was a beautiful thing. I love to see that. Those pictures are phenomenal. Two last little things. I noticed that the name of the streets, with the exception of one or two, are English names. I'm kind of
Yes.
curious. Why wouldn't they use Cree names, or at least two names, put Cree and English? That was kind of surprising, honestly.
Yes, it's a good question. And I thought about that when I was looking at the diagram. I was thinking about that too, and I don't know. I don't remember, because the stop signs, I have a photo, but they're in Cree. So all the stop signs are in Cree, but I wasn't sure why the street signs weren't in Cree. I don't know. And I think
Okay.
I know that some of them were named after people's last names, and so maybe like those last names are not Cree last names. So that was part of it too, I think. But I'm not sure. It's something
Okay.
interesting to
Okay.
look into.
And the last thing, after our initial conversation a few days ago, I looked up on the map, because I'll be honest, I've never heard of any of those communities before. And I looked initially on Google Maps. Doesn't show up on Google Maps. None of those communities exist on Google Maps. That side, with the exception of Chiasat, I forget one of the names. Just ask, with the exception of one or two names, none of those communities exist in Google's awareness, geographical.
Yes, yes. So there is a big issue with that. And one of the things that we talked a lot about with during our training was how there's still this ongoing problem of employment of Indigenous people in urban settings. And a really interesting thing that happens is with these really big companies, what they'll do is when they're filtering out resumes, they're looking at postal codes. And what they'll do is if the algorithm doesn't recognize a postal code, they'll reject it immediately. So all of these communities that, just like you said, Michael, aren't recognized on Google Maps, they're not recognized in any of these algorithms either. So they're having really big effects on people's lives who, they're not able to be recognized in the system because of where they live. And so slowly but surely, the communities there are people who are, there's actually two people while we were there who were doing some mapping and some GIS workshops there with the kids, and doing some more like learning about sort of, that's a whole other interesting conversation. But yes, there are people who are trying to get those communities onto the maps, but it's still a really big issue, and there are serious repercussions for not doing so.
Wow. Okay, no, that's fascinating. Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank Sydney. You've given us a window and an opportunity to understand and see and hear about something that none of us probably would ever in our lives would ever have had an opportunity to listen, and probably would not have had the initiative to look into it and explore. I'm also delighted by the fact that some of you from last week did take and make the effort to look into some of these elements about how we, as Jews, as Canadians, as Southerners, understand and relate to Indigenous culture and Indigenous narrative. So I thank you guys for that. I know Avi has one question, so just before you ask your question, Avi, 1 second. I just want to say that I think maybe one of the most important words I heard you use, Sydney, was this idea of collaboration. And often collaboration has this negative connotation to it, which we shouldn't allow, because collaboration is really the way different communities and people from different backgrounds need to work together. I gave you some understanding about the word alliance, perhaps in the context of the parashah, in the context of the person that was interviewed on CBC last week, and maybe alliances can be something that's positive, but we need to, and certainly in light of what's going on in the world today, we need to build more sustainable relationships with each other.
That's why even during training, sorry to interrupt, Michael, but they never used that word ally or building an alliance. It was always collaborate, because that's really what I mean, collaborate is a heavy word in a sense. It means being a supportive person and making space. I mean, the word ally has there's so many other things involved in those words. And so to be able to break them, to break them down and truly understand what that really means to collaborate. And I don't remember what you said. Oh, Southerners and Northerners. And I like that you mentioned that. That was also something that the words that they used to describe us, rather than saying the white people or, non-Indigenous people. It's just, we're the Southern counselors, and that was it. So that was something interesting, Michael. So thanks,
Sydney. So I think just as a final comment, I think in our duty, I think our obligation and responsibility is to, you're not going to think about every single word that comes out of your mouth. You never get anywhere with that. But we have to be more sensitive to the terms, the terminology we use to describe our dynamic with one another, and how we try to incorporate and collaborate with others to understand how that dynamic can and should look. So I hope that Sydney's insight and experience into what happened up on the east coast of James Bay last summer is something that gives you all motivation and perhaps a greater awareness of how we can label things, how we can designate our experiences, and how we need to learn a little bit more about those things that we're unfamiliar with, and certainly those things that are a little awkward and uncomfortable for us. So I want to really thank you, Sydney, for taking your time to join us this morning.
Thank you
Avi,
for having me.
Avi, if you're still there and you want to share that comment or question.
Yeah, I know that you were there a lot. I don't know, how did you feel that, like, were there a lot of English versus Cree variations between, like, were they speaking like Cree most of the time, or?
Yeah, it's a good question, Avi. So with us, I mean, they only spoke in English. So if we were around, they were only speaking in English. And the kids mostly spoke English between themselves. Sometimes they would speak Cree behind, each other's back if they didn't want kids to understand other kids or whatever it was. But most of the time, people would speak in English. But I think that was also due to the fact that whenever I saw that, I was there. So maybe when I wasn't there, they spoke in Cree. And so yeah, that's kind of my answer to that. I don't really know. I think they spoke English when we were there, whenever we were around, but when they were alone, I'm sure they do speak in Cree.
Well, everything in English, or everything?
Yeah, so everything was in English. Yeah, so like at the stores and everybody would speak English to us, and people would speak English when they were out and doing things for the most part. Yeah.
Thanks, Sydney. Okay, I know Stephen has a question as well. Maybe we'll just take one more.
Well, Sydney, thanks so much for sharing that. That's really quite something. You're asking if any of us recognize any of the towns up there. I recognize Moose Factory.
Because, yes. Moose Factory was on the map, but it is not one of the 9 communities in Iuichi.
Right. Well, I was going to say my brother-in-law did during his dentistry internship, there was a collaboration between the Mount Sinai Hospital and Moose Factory, and he had to spend a month up there. But his experience was quite different from yours. I think it's a lot more known up there. My question is, that side of James Bay is in Quebec.
Yes.
Why is French not the other language?
Good
question. Other thing, just sorry, before we get there, one other comment. Mike, this was brilliant to bring this in. I appreciate your having the initiative to bring Sydney in. I might suggest, when you have, I don't know how the yontivs are going to be organized. I guess that's still being organized by the committee, but it might be nice to have Sydney or one of her colleagues as one of your speakers. If you have a chavura service or something analogous to that, if you bring in guest speakers for those short little talks that you bring into the service, to have somebody on this topic come in so that the wider congregation, there's only 23 or 24 of us today, but I think if Sydney could come, or one of her colleagues, to speak to the wider congregation as one of your little stints that you organize during your services, might be very enriching for the services. So anyhow, just going back to the French, how come French wasn't the second language?
Yes, so French isn't right. It isn't spoken there. They learn it in school up until grade 5, I think, but it is not considered one of their languages. I think that came with agreements that they signed with Quebec. I don't know if it was a James Bay agreement. I'm not 100% sure, but they do have an agreement where they do not need to have it as their official language. So again, it comes with that self-determination, with, declaring their sovereignty of being able to be something that is separate from Quebec. Yes.
So they have an agreement that territory you mentioned?
Yes.
The Cree name is kind of respected by the Quebec government as being separate?
Yes. So unlike a lot of other communities which are reserves, so this community and all of the communities in the Cree Nation are not controlled by the government. So they have their own band office, and they're making their own decisions about their own community. So they don't really have any outside forces making decisions for them. So through those agreements, that's how they've been able to veer away from the French. So that's
But they have Quebec officers, you said, in their.
Yes. So they do. So their police force is actually the only thing that they have that is part of the Quebec government. But they've created an agreement about that. So that it wasn't. That's why I think it's also interesting to see that relationship with the police officers and the kids. Is I think that's one of the reasons why that relationship is so strong, because it's not against their will that they're coming there. It's been it's something that the community has agreed upon and has asked for to happen. So,
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, I thank everybody for joining us today, especially Sydney and all those who contributed. Stephen, don't think that wasn't my thoughts. I just didn't want to overwhelm Sydney with too many things at once. But Sydney, you'll be getting an email from me shortly.
You got 3 months. You got 3 months to relax.
So anyway, I hope all of you have a wonderful day. Thanks for joining again with continued study, as someone suggested at the beginning. And hopefully we can all learn to be better collaborators in the most positive senses in building a better and more understanding and tolerant community.
All kavod, Michael. And the idea of bringing Sydney in is a brilliant idea.
Thank you, Sydney, and everybody.
Thank you very much. I really
Healthy and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you for sharing.